All right, this PowerPoint will go through America's entrance into the war. It will look at the Western Front in 1917, and then we'll look at the end of the war and the armistice, and look at the balance sheet. After you do this PowerPoint, take notes as appropriate. You have the aims and goals of the Paris Peace participants, and then you have assignment 9 that you've done. So. I feel like we should have a solid grasp on the origins and the causes of the war, how the war was played out, the end of the war, and I would say if anything, we have a lighter grasp or command of material for the results. But my plan is that we can pick up from the results of the war when we look at Germany, Italy, and Japan in the interwar years when we do our prescribed subject in the 3rd unit. So focusing on the United States and their interest into the war. The other day we had left off with the war at the sea. We talked about the German unrestricted submarine warfare, how this was a problem for the Americans. And so there was other problems here when the war broke out. Other than just unrestricted submarine warfare, it was difficult for the United States to stay neutral in thought as well as in action, as Wilson had pleaded to the Americans to do in 1914 when war broke out. So a couple things here that made it difficult for the United States to stay neutral in the early parts of the war. First of all, immigration. Remember, America is a melting pot, so we have German, Irish, and Southeastern European immigrants that are coming in large waves during the 19th and early 20th century. And these are immigrants that were obviously they're born in their home country, or you have children that are first generation. So still these strong ties to their homelands. Another thing, that would be hard for Americans to stay neutral is that Germany's, and this is obviously a one interpretation of it, but Germany's quote unquote unprovoked declarations of war on France and Russia are really hard to justify. When you're trying to stay out of it or try to pick a side. The violation of Belgian neutrality, the stories of atrocities committed against Belgian citizens in the early part of the war, that's going to make it difficult for the Americans to stay out of it. By 1917, American firms had done somewhere in the ballpark of $2 billion in business with the Allies. U.S. banks had made $2.5 billion in loans to the Allies. So we are financially invested into this war as well, even before we actually officially get involved. And we're financially invested on the side of the Allies. So this is going to make it harder for Americans to stay neutral. We have Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare. So this really starts affecting neutral countries in February 1915 when Germany declares a war zone off the coast of Great Britain. We talked about Lusitania in May of 1915, and then in May of 1916, another ship was sunk called the Sussex. No American lives are lost. But Wilson says that if the Germans continue the practice of unrestricted submarine warfare, the U.S. will break off diplomatic relations with the Germans. And this is that's like the step that countries go through right before they go to war. So out of this, in May of 1916, you see the Sussex Pledge. And this is Germany pledging to not target passenger ships. They also say that merchant ships would not be sunk until the presence of weapons had been established. And if the search of a ship is necessary, this will be done. And then merchant ships would not be sunk without provision for the safety of passengers and crew. So we have, even though that this is going to make it unrestricted submarine warfare is going to make it difficult for the Americans to stay neutral, for a slight blip, we see that Germany does compromise with America to try to keep them out in 1916. And British propaganda is going to be another reason that it's difficult for the Americans to stay neutral. The Brits control the telegraph wires across the Atlantic, so the vast majority of reports that we're getting from World War I are coming from their perspective, which is obviously slanted. Woodrow Wilson is no different than anybody else. He sees his own evolution regarding his stance on war. 1914, he says, let's be neutral in thought as well as in action. 1916, he wins re-election on the campaign slogan, he kept us out of war. 1917, this is where we see him evolve. So January 22nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson makes a speech, and it's known as a Peace Without Victory speech. This Peace Without Victory speech allows us some insight into Wilson's idealism, if we remember about Kissinger. And also gives us some insights to Wilson is starting to evolve now and wanted to become a bigger player or participant in at least the post-war peace settlement. And there's just two paragraphs I think that speak strongly about his whole idea. And this is from his January 22nd speech. It says, "The terms of the immediate peace agreed upon will determine whether it is a peace for which such a guarantee can be secured. The question upon which the whole future peace and policy of this world depends is this. Is the present war a struggle for a just and secure peace, or only for a new balance of power? If it be only a struggle for a new balance of power, who can guarantee the stable equilibrium of the new arrangement? Only a tranquil Europe can be a stable Europe. There must be not a balance of power, but a community of power, not organized rivalries, but an organized common peace." And then he goes on, and I pick it up. They imply, first of all, that it must be a peace without victory. It is not pleasant to say this. I beg that I may be permitted to put my own interpretation upon it, and that it may be understood that no other interpretation was in my thought. I am seeking only to face realities, and to face them without soft concealments. Victory would mean peace forced upon the loser, a victor's terms imposed upon the vanquished. It would be accepted in humiliation, under duress, at an intolerable sacrifice, and would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon the terms upon which terms of peace would rest, not permanently, but only as upon quicksand. Only a peace between equals can last. Only a peace the very principle of which is equality and a common participation in a common benefit. The right state of mind, the right feeling between nations is as necessary for a lasting peace as is the just settlement of vexed questions of territory or of racial and national allegiance. Those two paragraphs, and look up January 22nd, 1917, Wilson's Peace Without Victory speech. Those two paragraphs there, I think, play to what Kissinger was saying in chapter 2, when he was talking about Wilson's idealism. January is also a big month, as far as getting the United States involved. January 31st, the Germans announced that they're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. February of 1917, Wilson asked Congress for the authority to arm the United States flag merchant vessels and to take all other military measures to protect American commerce. He calls this armed neutrality. In February as well, the British intelligence accept what's called the Zimmermann telegram and made it available to Wilson. This is essentially the Germans reaching out to Mexico and saying that if Mexico joins the side of the Central Powers, that the Germans can guarantee that they will get land lost during the Mexican-American War. The Mexican cession, essentially, California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Utah, as a guarantee, or trying to get Mexico into this war. The Germans can guarantee the land loss to the Mexican-American War. The British make it available to Wilson. Wilson publishes this on March 1st to the American people. Mexico backs away from it. I don't think they ever really seriously considered it. But this is definitely, you put this alongside with unrestricted submarine warfare, and the writing is essentially on the wall that the United States will join, and they will join on the side of the Allied powers. April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, and April 6th, 1917, the United States are officially at war. So 1917, picking up there with the Western Front. As a result of all those failures that we saw in 1916, both sides changed their high commands. Falkenhayn is out for the Germans. Ludendorff and Hindenburg, the heroes of Tannenberg on the Eastern Front, they're in. Joffre is going to be replaced by General Robert Nivelle. Nivelle's not any better than Joffrey. Nivelle's a self-doubter. He's a careless planner. He talked too openly about his projects. And in fact, when we talk about the strategy that he has, known as a Nivelle offensive, the Germans actually captured a full plan of this coming offensive, which is going to help them secure their own strategy, which is known as the Hindenburg Line. Talking on the Hindenburg Line, when Hindenburg and Ludendorff take over, they saw that the Germans were overextended on the Western Front and they were barely hanging on. They were outmanned. They had only 2.5 million men compared to 4 million men fighting for the Allies on the Western Front. And the goal here at the beginning of 1917 was to knock out Russia, what they're about to do, while restricting operation in the West to the most economical defense possible. So starting in February, the German army in France drew back on an average of 25 miles to a new and shorter line that could be held with 13 fewer divisions. So therefore, Hindenburg and Ludendorff are essentially saying, we don't have a lot of men. We're about to defeat Russia. Let's go ahead and knock them out. And while we're knocking out Russia, let's go ahead and resort to more of a defensive, shorter front line. So when the Germans are starting to evacuate, this is in like March of 1917, when the Germans are starting to evacuate and withdrawing behind this new defensive position, which will become known as the Hindenburg Line, the towns that laid between the Germans and the Allies, to make it even harder for the Allies to get to the Germans and to give the Germans time to withdraw, the Germans destroyed everything in their path. The Germans mined the roads, they destroyed the trees, they poisoned the wells, they blew up houses and other buildings, they booby-trapped these towns, and so we see here in the early part of 1917 on the Western Front, the Germans have withdrawn back to this new defensive position. It's a shorter line. It can be defended with fewer men, and is known as the Hindenburg Line. The video right below the strategy shows you the makeup of this new defensive position. And remember, this is a defensive position that is being created as the French are trying to plan this offensive, and the Germans know that this offensive is coming, which allows them allows them the time and the security to build this line and be prepared for that offensive in April. Speaking of that, the Nivelle offensive is set for April of 1917. When the offensive starts on April 16th, 1917, the French found an enemy that was better entrenched and farther away than they ever expected. This is the Hindenburg Line. Nivelle said, when they were planning this offensive, that he would have cut off the offensive within 48 hours if it wasn't going well. By the first day, we could tell that this wasn't going well, but Nivelle keeps it going. Nivelle's offensive, he had called for 6 miles here in April of 1917. He gets 600 yards. The French are going to lose 120,000 soldiers. By the end of this offensive, or this failed offensive, French soldiers had had enough. You start to see mutinies going through the lines here in with the French army. There's mass refusals to move up front, mass refusals to attack from these soldiers. There's no violence against their commanders, just a refusal to attack. As a result, Nivelle's going to be kicked out. All right, Pétain, the hero of the Verdun, will be brought in. And he is going to try to restore confidence in this demoralized army. He's going to start to address the soldiers' grievances. He's going to start to introduce steps to improve rations and medical care. He promises to limit his operation to an aggressive defense. So these local attacks of just limited duration. And so this is where we see 1917 on the Western Front. As the Germans are starting to take care of the Russians, they've decided to go back to withdraw, actually retreat in their territory, go to a shorter and stronger defensive line known as the Hindenburg Line. And they do this in preparation for the oncoming offensive in April from the French. The Nivelle offensive, all right, because he talked too openly about his plans. He gave the Germans time to prepare for this offensive. This offensive is a huge disaster, and Nivelle gets kicked out. Pétain gets brought in, and 1917 on the Western Front remains a defensive struggle here. The next slide in the next video, we'll look at how 1918 brings a renewed German effort to win the war before they run out of reserves, but however, it fails. All right, this video, the next one that talks about this slide, won't take too terribly long, but please make sure that you see it.